Hey.
We are live.
We are live.
We are live. Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
I am here, Chris Anderson. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Doing well.
What's the situation in London?
The situation in London is they say that we're supposed to reach herd immunity by the end of the month. Pubs are opening up for outdoor service tomorrow. We're all very excited about that. And haircuts. So
that's fantastic. I think we had a little scheduling snafu and put the show, it said it was at 4, but our viewers don't actually seem to have noticed that and seem to have all shown up. So
oh, that's good.
We've inculcated them in the correct habits then for the broadcast.
Very Pavlovian.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. We'll wait a moment for everybody to join us, and please post and say hi and tell us where you're watching from. We're here talking about history every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. And all of our broadcasts are also archived on the History Happy Hour webpage, which is on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours website. Site. Who's with us, Chris? Who's here with us?
Oh, well, Marcus, of course, so we can start
Marcus
officially.
is always first, yes.
Brian from Golden State, and John Matthew from Toronto. Doreen, of course, and her posse. Valerie from Normandy. Xavier! Hey, Xavier's here.
Xavier is here. So, well, we are delighted that everybody's here, and we hope we haven't prevented anyone from coming. But honestly, if they tune in at 4, they'll still see it. They'll just be seeing it on tape. So that's okay as well. So, Chris, do you think we are about ready to get going here?
I do believe we are. You ready?
With the events of the day? Okay.
Yes. The bar is open.
The bar is open. And Chris, we will start by giving you the floor because I think you have a few words to say about a person who has been in the news this week.
Yes. Well, as most of you know, I hope most of you know, Prince Philip passed away earlier this week. And as you would expect, there's been an awful lot of news coverage of Philip's passing here in Britain. And it was I don't know, it was oddly affecting. We walked down to Trafalgar Square and it was all lit up with a picture of him, and went to Buckingham Palace. Flags were all at half-mast. And it's the passing of an era. And I'm sure that it's on the news in the States, and I really don't need to get into really what he did or what this means for the royal family or Meghan or any of that nonsense, because quite frankly, I don't care. But
Fair
in the
enough.
midst of all the news coverage, I just would like to say, please remember that in Philip's case, all those medals on his chest he earned. And I just wanted to read out very briefly his awards for the Second World War were the 3945 Star, the Africa Star, the Atlantic Star, the Burma Star with clasp, Italy Star War Medal 1939 to 1945 with a mentioned in dispatches bar, and the Naval Long Service Good Conduct with 6 bars award. So he lived a good life. He served his adopted country well. And so I just wanted to say fair winds and following seas.
Very nice tribute to Prince Philip, and here. So we'll transition to our topic of the day, which is amphibious warfare. And we've all seen the pictures and sometimes film of the landing boats hitting the beaches at D-Day or Iwo Jima. And the question, though, is how did the U.S. develop the expertise to be able to conduct operations such as D-Day? And 75 years later, after World War II, is amphibious warfare still something relevant to the U.S. military? And we're going to explore those questions today with Dr. David Nasca, who is the author of a new book, The Emergence of American Amphibious Warfare, 1898 to 1945. And I'll say it's not simply about the nuts and bolts of landing troops on the beaches, although that's one of the things covered. The book also lays out the idea that, in fact, the development of amphibious warfare techniques played a pivotal role in the U.S. becoming a superpower, and they may be important in the U.S. maintaining its position today. So we'll get into that with David Nasca, and I want to mention that he holds graduate degrees in international relations, diplomacy, history, military studies, and national security from several universities, as well as a PhD from Salve Regina University. And lest you think he has spent all his time on book learning, it might be worth mentioning that David Nasca is also a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps who has done multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I know we have several ex-Marines in the audience. Please give David a shout. Is there such a thing as an ex-Marine? Not really,
I think
right?
Once a Marine, always a Marine.
Once a Marine, always a Marine. And I'm sure David would like me to add, or he's already thinking about how he should say it for himself, that he is speaking today for himself and not for the Marine Corps. And we're interested in hearing what you have to say for yourself. David, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rick and Chris. We're happy to be here.
Oh,
fantastic. Great. So what are you drinking? Perhaps you're one of the teetotaling branch of Marines, but perhaps not.
This could make or break the sale of the book here. I'm drinking a 7x7, which is Seagram 7 and 7-Up here for this talk.
Okay, we can
mixed drinks.
Mixed drinks.
We welcome your comments on David's drink. And Chris, what are you going for?
The Woodford's Reserve.
All right, fair enough. I've got the Abbé Left beer, and from Belgium, famous for its amphibious warfare capability, and so
the vicious swimming dogs.
Obviously, the most appropriate. David, when I think about the development of modern amphibious warfare, I think maybe like a lot of people, I would tend to start with Gallipoli and the disastrous landings in Gallipoli during World War I and begin there. But you, in your book, start a little earlier, in 1898, with the Spanish-American War. So tell me, why start there? What happened, and what was the significance of it?
I started with the Spanish-American War because that's pretty much one of the first times the United States has deployed troops overseas against a foreign power in significant numbers. It was a major war back in the late 19th century. It was something that the Americans haven't done before, especially their last major war was the American Civil War. And so going up against the Spanish Empire, there were a lot of the nations were kind of skeptical whether or not the United States would even be able to take on a European power at that time. So that's why I started with 1898, because we see the first real deployments and the first use of naval and ground forces against a foreign enemy. And
it's pretty, one hesitates to use this word, but it's kind of primitive. You literally, right, if I'm correct, you have, they can't really get onto the beach. They've got soldiers pushing the horses off the ships and soldiers jumping off to get onto the beaches. It's not a very sophisticated picture.
Listen, I can tell you that it's good to know, like even in today, like back then, over 100 years ago, like we kind of wing it like Americans do, So it's like you would think the Americans did this deliberate, systematic approach, like, okay, first we're going to develop our Navy and our ground forces, then we'll be ready to take on the Spanish Empire, And that wasn't the case, Just like Americans, we kind of learned as we went along, especially when we were fighting the Spanish in Cuba and the Philippines.
So David, kind of along those lines, obviously you start with the Spanish-American War, but amphibious warfare, as such, goes back to the ancients.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But my two questions are: one, when does it officially become amphibious warfare as a distinctive kind of thing? And because you cover so much in the book and you go through so many levels, is there actually a difference between amphibious warfare and naval warfare? Are these considered to be two different things, or is it?
For my opinion, it's two different things. Naval warfare, I'm thinking of like the Battle of Trafalgar and all that stuff there. For amphibious warfare, it's something that's been going on for centuries. But it was not until the emergence of American amphibious warfare that we start to see something a little bit more organized and deliberate. Like when you look at the Peloponnesian War, for example,
Right.
I think about the Amphibian expedition to Syracuse, and how they put all their eggs in one basket to go seize the city and hopefully use the city to kind of beat the Spartans and their allies, and instead it turns out to be a total fiasco, and then you got the season of Quebec, where the British land in the plains of Abraham, and then they end up beating the French and seizing control of the city in the North American continent. Or you can look at like when the fact that you got the William the Conqueror landing over in England there and seizing control of the country and carving out his own kingdom there. So when I think of amphibious warfare, I think of that type of thing, but I think of it as an ad hoc operation until you start getting to the late 19th, or probably around the American Civil War. You start to see a little bit more deliberate planning, professionalism.
So it becomes a defined thing. As
Absolutely.
opposed to just
Yeah, absolutely,
Okay.
Chris.
So and the American Revolution, we left it up with the British invasion of New York. With their landing
Just skip
craft.
that part. Just skip
Landing craft, landing landing in Brooklyn, right?
Yeah, or Bunker Hill. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes.
True, they have to transport across. So, but it also seems like, and we can get into this because it's probably happening again today. But in the past, it also seems like amphibious warfare is constantly being. Critics are saying, "Oh, well, that's obsolete." Okay, the latest thing proves that going back to the Peloponnesian War or whatever. Oh, amphibious warfare, it's too hard, it's too dangerous. We should just not do that and forget about that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the fascinating part, I think the cool part is that even though we think that way today, that amphibious warfare is kind of antiquated and is quite quaint for a bygone era. I think when you look at the late 19th and early 20th century, you kind of see the same thing, especially after Gallipoli, where you have like the British who kind of are successful in conducting landings in the colonies in Asia, the South Pacific, Africa against German colonies. And then when Gallipoli comes along in 1915, the British try to build the Iron Mountain, and when they push in, instead of knocking out a second-rate power, they end up getting their butts kicked big time. And it turns out to be a total disaster. I mean, Churchill, steps down from office as the Lord of Admiralty, and then he throws himself into the Western Front to show that he's still behind the war effort. Yeah.
So that's a case where the failure to be able to master the amphibious warfare really has a strategic impact on that war.
Oh, absolutely. I think like some people would argue that doing amphibious operations is like a gambler's throw. But I mean, if you look at the Second World War and the Americans conducting amphibious operations, I mean, they've been pretty much the majority of it successful. I mean, you can make the argument for Anzio, but simply holding the beach and what was the old saying Churchill said, like, we were trying to throw a bobcat ashore or something like that, but instead we threw a beached whale instead. Yep. So the Americans definitely had their moments in close calls. I mean, Tarawa, Anzio, just pick any of the specific island campaigns, Iwo Jima. So, I mean, it wasn't quite a gambler's throw, but they were prepared to suffer the consequences of this thing going south.
So, but I guess one of the things I'm trying to nail down, and is when do the Americans say, okay, this is kind of a distinctive form of conducting military operations? I mean, so, as I was reading your book, I was looking at General Order 13.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, well, okay, there's somebody trying to sit down and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And before that, I don't really see like any manuals. I don't see any,
No, you don't. I mean, it's not till the interwar years. Like after Gallipoli, the British do like an after-action report, and they kind of dig into it to try to learn how to do amphibious capabilities better initially. And then, of course, you got the peace dividend that comes in after the Treaty of Versailles. You got the rise of collective security, the League of Nations. So for the British, their focus was more on not who the next major power they're going to fight against. They were looking more as policing their empire at that time. And their focus tended to be more on aviation as it became the new best thing that was coming up in the military technology. For the Americans, they kind of looked at it in another way. And when I say the Americans, the Marine Corps, and I think again, just an opinion. I think the Marine Corps was looking at a new thing that defined who it is and what it's supposed to do. Because when people think about Marines back in the early 20th century, or even during the 19th century, they're thinking of the guys that protect the captain of the ship, or provide maritime interdiction, or use as naval police. And you got people like Lejeune and Ellis, who come up with what we call a paradigm shift, which was redefine the Marine Corps to look at what they called forward base operations, that eventually evolved into amphibious warfare, which is being able to land in an opposed beach and build combat power from 0 to 100.
So that's in the 20s and 30s, right?
That was in the 20s and 30s, and it was but the 20s and 30s, arguably, a lot of other countries, as it became apparent that the League of Nations just wasn't working, a lot of unhappy people were walking away from the Treaty of Versailles. They were kind of looking at round 2 on how to correct what they fought in their own respective countries, the injustices that were the result of the First World War. So you got the Germans exploring, mission-type orders or Houtier tactics, also armored warfare. You got the British looking at aviation and radar. You got the Japanese and the Americans looking at naval aviation.
So it's a time of great innovation on everybody's part, because they're looking ahead. And I'd like to in a minute, and maybe Chris would like to as well. I imagine Chris would like to as well. Talk about some people that you mentioned, General Lejeune and Lieutenant Colonel Pete Ellis. But before we do that, there's one other thing. In the 20s and 30s, they're studying these amphibious operations of World War I. And so Gallipoli is the super famous one, right?
Yes.
Everybody knows Gallipoli. We tried to land in Turkey and at the Dardanelles, and it goes wrong, and Churchill gets thrown out of office. And so that's obviously a big sign that says, don't do amphibious. And then there's another operation that's conducted by the Germans. It's smaller, but it's Operation Albion, and it takes place up in the Baltic, and it kind of offers a different lesson. So tell us about Operation Albion and the impact that might have had on planning in the 20s and 30s.
Oh, absolutely. So for the Marine Corps during the 20s and 30s, they're not only exploring Gallipoli, but they also came across the success of the Baltic Sea campaign known as Operation Albion. And it took place in 1917, where the German Army and the German Navy, who rarely talk to each other, and even worse, they rarely get along with each other, were able to set aside their differen's.
Unlike any other Army and Navy ever.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. Even like for the Marines and the Navy and any of the services, they have their animosities, and whatnot here. But for the Germans, this was a smashing success because it allowed them to seize 3 critical islands off the Baltic coast, which pretty much was almost like creating a bottleneck on St. Petersburg, which was to prevent the Russian Navy from going out into the Baltic Sea. So what was amazing about this was that the Germans were able to do this ad hoc with the Navy. They were able to land and catch these heavily fortified islands completely by surprise with minimal casualties, take control of these islands and their coastal guns, and be able to bottle up the Russian Navy in St. Petersburg. But more importantly, it also positioned them to possibly even conduct another amphibious operation against St. Petersburg. Whether the Germans did it or not, that wasn't the point, but it was the psychological fear of the Germans being able to do that struck fear into the Russian government, which was going through this major transition. And some people would argue to say that it led to the collapse of Russia and the rise of the Soviet Union. Again, these are just people who make those type of arguments. But for the Marine Corps, when they took a look at this campaign, and it was thanks to German exchange students that were onesies and twosies that served in the Marine Corps schools aboard Quantico, they were able to realize that perhaps Gallipoli isn't like the only lesson we can learn about amphibious operations. Here's an example where amphibious operations had a major strategic success in knocking out a major power. So that's why they looked at this one, which was really interesting because I never knew it existed.
I never heard of it
until I was at Expeditionary Warfare School in Quantico, and a lot of the instructors kept talking about Operation Albion, and they did a thorough study, more of that than they did of Gallipoli, on what right looks like during the interwar years.
That's fascinating.
But David, you say like most of the countries during World War I came away from Gallipoli saying that's really bad, and we'll get into it later. But it casts a long shadow over British operations.
Mm-hmm.
But you seem to indicate in the book that the Americans said, well, there's stuff to be learned here, and there's value in this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that the Americans saw that nobody else seemed to see?
I think what
happened there.
Oh, for Gallipoli, I think what they were looking at was just how the British Expeditionary Force, with the support of the French, how they built the Iron Mountain, and they kind of look at things that possibly went wrong.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, David.
No, that's right.
I'm a rude guy. What can I tell you? I just apologize for that. But
that's right.
The Iron Mountain is a great phrase. You use it in the book, but I don't think our audience knows what that means.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about the Iron Mountain.
Absolutely. So the Iron Mountain is a term that's used where when you land an expeditionary force aboard the beach, you're building up the supplies, the logistics, the weapons, the ammunition so you can push inland, and also to build up enough troops so you can continue your advance. So for Gallipoli, when you see that picture, you see all these supplies piling up. They're doing what any amphibious force would do. It's a deliberate landing. You're trying to get organized. You're trying to put the army together aboard the shore, and you're trying to push inland as quickly as possible. But I think in this case, what the Marines learned was that the British landed in like a peninsula, so they not only bottlenecked themselves, but they also landed in very difficult terrain too to advance. So it wasn't like they could land and quickly push inland. Even if they were able to land the troops, they still have to negotiate over that rough terrain, pushing the supplies and advancing quickly enough against Constantinople to arguably knock the Turks out of the war. But what they weren't expecting is the Turks to be having been guided by German advisors to quickly contain the landing force, keep it on the beaches, and allow reinforcements to catch up. And they utilized the terrain. They utilized the British disorientation when they landed on the beaches. And I think for the Marines and then for the other services, as they were getting educated on amphibious warfare in preparation for World War II, they kind of understood that we need to learn from these types of mistakes and take countermeasures to prevent that from happening again. So that's where the intelligence comes in, where you're collecting not just the type of sand that's on the beaches, but also the tides as well. You're also taking a look at the surrounding terrain, looking at the dispositions of enemy forces. So I think by like World War II, even though the Americans didn't perfect it when they started using it, they definitely had a couple lessons that they learned from their British counterparts. So. And then there's also another thing that people don't talk about. They also don't talk about like the Japanese also experimenting with amphibious warfare too. Right. When you look at some of these stuff at the Gray Research Center aboard Quantico, and you look at like First Lieutenant Victor Krulak, his intelligence reports while he was with 4th Marines, he was taking photos of Japanese landings in Shanghai back in 1932. And it was almost like you're kind of size up your competition a little bit. But more importantly, they always say plagiarism is the best form of flattery. So whatever the Japanese were doing and it looked good and it sounded good, let's go ahead and do that too. So it's pretty amazing.
Because it seems like the Japanese are actually developing a doctrine, right, before we are, or as we're still trying to come up with our own system here.
No, yes.
But one of the things I think maybe to kind of get into World War II, so the Marines and the Army, but the Marines in particular, they come out of World War I. They're still sort of that constabulary force. They're still shipboards, ship security, port. Partly out of desperation, unless I'm wrong. Somebody says, we got to come up with a mission here because otherwise...
we'll get absorbed into the Army or the Navy.
Yeah. Right. So it's this kind of a survival in a lot of fronts here. But so take us from World War I, 1918, a bunch of Marine officers going, well, boy, I see the bean counters coming. What do we do?
No, absolutely.
To,
No, you're right, Chris. And what I think about when I think about like what was the engine for change that prompted the Marine Corps, I always think of President Theodore Roosevelt, where he puts that executive order throwing Marines off board ship, and he's my favorite president too. So I'm like, oh, you're cool on so many levels, except ostracizing the Marines from the Navy ships, But we're not all perfect, so I forgive the president for that there. But what I thought was interesting was so when the Marines were thrown off aboard, serving aboard naval ships for a while, the Marines had to kind of reinvent themselves, and they kind of been talking about forward base operations and what they learned from the Spanish-American War. And it's interesting, they didn't look at it just simply landing troops and seizing terrain. They looked at it as more of seizing a piece of coastal beach, setting up big guns in support of the U.S. fleet off the shore. So they looked at the Marine Corps as a supporting force for the U.S. Navy as they engaged these big battle Trafalgar type of things with the dreadnoughts and the battleships and whatnot there. But then as time went by, you got a guy named Pete Ellis, lieutenant colonel type, who comes up with advanced base operations in Micronesia. He was a graduate from the Naval War College. He was kind of tinkering around the fact that, you know what, our showdown with Japan, which was starting to slowly come to light during the interwar years, he was kind of thinking about how was the war against Japan going to be fought, and they looked at like seizing key islands across the Pacific and eventually using those islands to eventually attack the mainland of Japan there. So because of Pete Ellis, he kind of had this conceptual vision of what the next war would look like. And that's the difficulty for any military organization or country, is trying to predict how the next war is going to be fought. I mean, we're doing that today in the 21st century. How is the next war going to be fought in the 21st century? So for Pete Ellis, he was able to predict almost verbatim like how the war in the Pacific was going to be fought. And then just like anything else, they were able to seize a lot of those ideas and apply that to Europe and North Africa.
All right, but let's put that part in the middle, though, where a lot of people said Pete Ellis was out of his flippant mind.
Yeah, he was.
It was kind of a hard sell for him, wasn't it?
Yeah, so like he was kind of like he was called like the prophet of amphibious warfare, but he was like, some people considered him like a crackpot, I mean, the guy was in the Marine Corps for over 20 years, but a lot of people forget that he was also a decorated war hero. He was also the operations planner for Major General Lejeune during World War I, and he had a lot of influence, but he definitely had some personal idiosyncrasies that were almost borderline self-destructive. He
was an alcoholic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then he married a plowing wife, and then he gets killed under mysterious circumstances.
He kind of disappears on an island somewhere.
It's kind of interesting. He dies in like 1923, right? Is that?
Absolutely.
So it's only 5 years after the end of World War I, but he has sort of predicted what's going to happen in the Pacific in World War II, and sort of said we've got to engage in these kinds of combined amphibious operations.
Yeah, and he also put a twist to it where he was in the Western Front and he saw trench warfare and the attrition warfare that was taking place, and he applied that to the upcoming war that everyone was thinking about against Japan. Because when you think about Japan, they're thinking about the Russo-Japanese War or the Sino-Japanese War, where the Japanese weren't like a backward power. They were a modern power that were able to defeat two major powers in the region. Arguably, people thought China was going to crush Japan, but then there was kind of like cracks in that country that they were realizing that China's not as strong as it was back in the late 19th century. Same thing with Russia. Everyone thought that the Russians were going to trounce the Japanese, and instead they do kind of like a Pearl Harbor attack, but against Arthur. Seize the port and then drive them up to northern China Russian border and stuff. So the fact that Pete Ellis was able to predict that the Pacific War was going to be a war of attrition in some of those islands, he was absolutely correct.
And
is he the guy? Okay, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Chris.
No.
I insist.
So is he the guy that says advanced base operations? Is he the guy that kind of coins that term, or where does that come from?
Oh yeah, it was like based. I think that was based on his advanced play. It was having to do with his war plan, his op plan having to do with Micronesia, and he was trying to. It was part of that whole rainbow plan thing where the United States was kind of predicting potential peer competitors. Like red was the British, the yellow was the Japanese, and then black was the Germans. So they each had like a kind of like anything else, a war plan against an eventual conflict with a certain major power. So they pull out these plans in the Pentagon, they dust them off, they take a look at it, or even at the COCOMs, they take a look at it. What would a potential war look like in this scenario? And that's what Pete Ellis was doing, was no different than what the military does today.
And Pete Ellis is working for, General Lejeune, who is the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He's also a key figure in this, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the thing about General Lejeune, though, was that there was also another competitor, which was General Smedley Butler. And I know you guys have a great picture of them having a smoke and all that, and they're
Sig buddies tight there.
Yeah, exactly. But you got two visionaries. You got General Smedley Butler, who who came of age in the Marine Corps during the Banana Wars. So he fought in a whole bunch of wars in the Caribbean and in Central America. He was also in the Boxer Rebellion as well. And then you got Lejeune, who's a Naval Academy grad, who fought in the First World War, who was able to see modern mechanized warfare for the first time. And then there's this clash in personalities. Smedley Butler saw the vision of the Marine Corps becoming like a small wars force, like a colonial force, while Lejeune kind of embraced Pete Ellis's vision of transforming the Marine Corps into a modern amphibious force. So when Lejeune becomes a commandant of the Marine Corps and Smedley Butler doesn't, he takes it in a totally different direction, which I find very fascinating. He modernizes the Marine Corps schools in Quantico. He also begins devoting funds during the 1920s and 30s into modernize, kind of experimenting with amphibious warfare, especially in the Caribbean as well, especially off some of the islands off Puerto Rico, where they do exercises and they do war gaming and whatnot. And then, of course, during the 1930s, when other commandants followed in his footsteps, they also developed the Tentative Landing Manual, which is like the Bible on how to conduct amphibious operations.
Well, you talked about this in the book. Why is it called the Tentative Landing Manual? Why isn't it the Aggressive Manual?
Because that's such a thrilling title.
I know.
The Tentative Landing Manual is like, maybe we'll land. I'm not sure.
Well, the thing is that most of it was garnered just from the exercises that were conducted in the Caribbean there, and so it was a living, breathing document, which means that it was always changing.
Change. Yeah.
So during the 1930s, as they're carefully watching the Japanese conduct amphibious operations, it's like, okay, we'll go ahead and use this eraser and erase that part out because we know that's not going to work, or this is better from what the Japanese are doing. So I'll be honest, I don't know why they call it the Tentative Landing Manual, but I'm sure that's why it was. If they said this is the landing manual, then they're completely wrong. Then the other services,
somebody's head's on the block.
Exactly.
It's always much more safer. I think we should have tentative history happy hours that we put out there and we try it, and maybe this is the history happy hour. We'll see.
Absolutely.
Should we, Chris? We all have
questions.
We have some questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
No problem.
I thought I would take Skip's question if that works for you.
That would be great.
Skip Cornett is a Coast Guard veteran, and he wants to know if the Coast Guard played any role in the interwar development of amphibious war, because it seems like a natural to him. So what do you got for us on that?
I can tell you that. Thank you for your service to the Coast Guard. My grandfather was in the Coast Guard during World War II, and me and my dad joined the Marine Corps. So obviously we were immediately ostracized from the family when they found out about that. But I hate to say this. I mean, I don't know that much of the role of what the Coast Guard played in amphibious operations, but I can tell you that since this book came out, the great thing about it is I get a lot of emails and I get a lot of people that stop by the office in Lejeune Hall that talk to me, hey, have you thought about this? Or you thought about the role that aviation played in amphibious warfare? And I learn new things every day there. Especially
second edition. Exactly.
Absolutely.
You should have called it the Tentative Emergence of American Amphibious Warfare.
Once you commit to the title, then it's like, okay, well, I'll let the stones and arrows come. But no, that would be a great thing to explore, And I think in my book, what I made it clear in my introduction is that this is just my perspective on amphibious warfare, and that the purpose of the book was to generate discussion and to examine other aspects of amphibious warfare. So to get these emails, to get the phone calls, and to get the Facebook messages, I'm very appreciative of it. And there's a lot of people who know way more about amphibious warfare than I do, and it gives them a great opportunity to contribute to the story, because I can only tell so much in one book, and I'm excited about continuing my passion and learning more about amphibious warfare and its history. So yeah, absolutely. I know that the Coast Guard played a significant role in amphibious operations during World War II, especially.
So, do you want to ask Ken's? Should I put Ken's?
Here, you go
question?
ahead. You go ahead.
Right,
I'll find it here.
I'm going to. Yeah. So, one of our guests, because he knows about.
David is the guest. Ken is in the audience.
No, sorry.
It's different. We're not actually leading a tour. We're actually at home right now, Chris.
I'm sorry, Rick.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Okay. So
the question is, You can read it. After the Gallipoli experience, the British were wary of amphibious operations. Then they do Dieppe. Why?
I think for Dieppe, and again, it's just an opinion, they were kind of testing the water, so to speak, So there's a gentleman that reached out to me and said I didn't talk enough about Dieppe, and he's absolutely right. This guy wrote like a whole book on the Dieppe raid and all that. But I think, again,
who was it?
I forgot. It's like
O'Keefe. David O'Keefe.
Yeah,
he was our
O'Keefe.
guest last week.
Yeah. He reached out to me, and I just bought his book. So my operational and tactical knowledge of Dieppe is very limited, but I do know that from a strategic level, my opinion was that they were kind of testing the Atlantic wall to see if it was feasible to do it. And when the Dieppe raid turns out to be costly, it was almost like for the British, like, we shouldn't do that again. And instead, they were kind of focusing on something that was safer and that can inflict harm on Nazi Germany. In this case, looking at North Africa, looking at the quote-unquote the soft underbelly of Europe, which was Italy at that time. So for Dieppe, they kind of were like the Americans. The Americans just wanted to go straight into land in France and push on through. And I think the British felt that the Americans, because they weren't experienced and they didn't have the technology and weapons yet, they didn't want them to make the same mistakes they did when they did the Dieppe raid.
And the British were just worried they wouldn't have enough Canadians to get the job. Sorry, had to get that in there.
So so part of the story also in the interwar period is very closely connected with the Marine development is one of my heroes, Andrew Jackson Higgins, who is the developer of the Higgins boat, which of course the LCVP, which is the ubiquitous donkey craft of every amphibious invasion in World War II. And he's got some close connections to the Marines, right? And they are actually eyeing his boats 10 years before the war even starts.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, Higgins was kind of like one of those tinkerers down south, and he developed the Higgins boat, which was not supposed to be used for amphibious landings. He kind of looked at it more as a rescue craft during floodings and natural disasters, And so the Marine Corps, which was experimenting with different types of amphibious craft, come across this, and they immediately fall in love with it, and therefore wanted to not only purchase his boats, but also expand his operations to also help kind of equipped the amphibious force that was getting ready to ship across the Pacific,
Yeah,
And then,
I'm sorry.
Absolutely. No, go ahead, Rick.
No, I just one of my favorite. You brought it up. One of my favorite facts about Andrew Jackson Higgins and his company is in 1940 he has a company of 50 people in New Orleans, and in 1950 he has a company of 50 people in New Orleans. But in 1944 he has a company of 20,000 people in New Orleans.
Yes, it's insane. It's totally insane. And then, of course, like the Army wants landing craft too, so he's trying to. What they called like economic or cost opportunities. Where do you devote these landing craft to? Europe or the Asia Pacific region? And in this case, you got the U.S. Army that grabs a whole bunch of them in preparation for not just North Africa and Italy, but for the big landing in Normandy with Operation Overlord.
So, David, one of the questions I have though is, as the Marines, I mean, I think it's safe to say they're kind of inventing what's going to be amphibious warfare in World War II, right?
No, absolutely.
No, but right. So they're blazing a trail because they want to continue to exist and not get done away with. What's the Navy think of this while this is going on? What does the Army think? Are they going, who are these guys and what are they doing? Or just let them go play and maybe they'll go away? Or what's the reaction? Because they're doing it alone.
Yeah, so like for the Army, I thought it was interesting where they kind of like take the tentative landing manual and they use everything almost verbatim in planning their own amphibious operations. But the funny part is there's no Marines. I mean, there's a few Marines involved in the amphibious operations here, but they're more of just like onesies and twosies, not like whole Marine battalions or regiments or divisions landing in Europe. Right. So the Army adopts a lot of the amphibious like tactics and planning that the Marine Corps developed during the interwar years, So it almost like they pushed the Marine Corps out of the way. Again, it's just an opinion, Well,
no. So it seems like they're not ready for the war at all because they haven't been involved in
Oh no, like for the Army,
and then they're like, oh
yeah.
shoot.
Yeah, so for the Army, they're thinking of the big tank battles that they're reading about they get in the Eastern Front against the Soviets, and then they realize that, well, before we get to that stage, we need to be able to land in continental Europe and North Africa, and I think the Army realizes it, and they adopt the tentative landing manual as kind of like the basis for being able to conduct amphibious operations, And then meanwhile, for the Navy, they're thinking not like necessarily amphibious operations. They're thinking of the big final Trafalgar type of battle that they're going to have against the Japanese Navy. They're thinking about like what you call like another Jutland, like a Battle of Jutland type of thing. But it kind of doesn't happen unless you count like the Battle of Leyte Gulf or some of the later battles, because it becomes primarily a lot of naval aviation fight that goes on between the fleets and stuff.
Rick.
Sorry, I was just practicing talking without sound.
You did really well. You passed.
Thank you so much. The Navy and Army then presumably are still paying royalties to the Marine Corps for their assistance during the amphibious warfare, right?
Like I say, plagiarism is the best form of flattery, So what team, what fight, so they say,
There's so many things we can talk about, but I want to bring in some footage that we have. In late 1943, the U.S. Marines assault the Pacific island of Tarawa, and there's a terrific film made of this, which you actually referenced in the book, and so I went and looked it up and watched it, which was also kind of controversial at the time. But it's a color footage of this island invasion in the Pacific, and I want to just play a minute of it here as the Marines are approaching the beach in Tarawa, and then come back to you with a question.
As we approach the island, we have the feeling that the show is just about over. There doesn't seem to be any organized resistance. However, we're taking no chances. Suddenly, we're met by heavy machine gun and mortar fire. It takes a heavy toll of our boats and men. It doesn't stop us. Fight our way onto the beach. Our men wade ashore from wrecked amphibians.
I mean, that's amazing footage, and yet no, that's not from a rehearsal, right? That is from the invasion of Tarawa. So, and by the way, for all our viewers, I put a link to that video on the reading list page on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours website if you want to see that. But Tarawa was very bloody and criticized by some people as unnecessary, and it's almost immediately followed in early 1944 by the Anzio seaborne invasion in Italy, which ends up being a whole mess. So did these two landings, which were maybe not unqualified successes, have any impact on the planning for the big D-Day Normandy invasion?
I think for like Tarawa, the reason why there's so much footage of it is because it's really the first time that the American military goes into a heavily fortified island and is able to conduct an imposed amphibious landing. The reason why they wanted to videotape it is they wanted to see what it looked like. I mean, the after-action reports and the photos can only do so much, but being able to videotape it and be able to bring it back to the States so strategic planners, operational planners can learn from what it's like to be down at the ground level would help them prepare for the realities that they'll face in Normandy. And the thing about it is that Tarawa wasn't a sure thing. It was, as a matter of fact, they had to make the decision on whether or not to commit their reserves into reinforcing the landing force in Tarawa. So when the American people read about the heavy losses of like 5,000 Americans killed and wounded for like a small island, that's like only a couple miles wide and long, the American people had to ask why, and then, they made it into a documentary, and it was so gruesome that they had to get the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's permission to release it. And he asked his friend, Robert Sherwood, who was a reporter at the front, asking him if he should do it. And he says that he would want, the service members would want this video shown to the American people to show that they don't knock the hell out of the enemy at every single encounter and every single battle, and that they wanted to show that war is a very nasty business. And instead of demotivating the American people, it galvanized the American people to contribute more to the war bonds and the war effort, because this was a global conflict that was for keeps. And I think the American people, when they were able to see with their own eyes the tenacity and the viciousness of modern warfare, especially in a South Pacific island no one heard about, they realized that there's still a long slog ahead, and they can't sit this one out.
But
oh yeah, go ahead.
No, they were really shocked by that footage. That documentary shocked a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't sanitized or anything like that. And the interesting part was that when people asked about the strategic significance, the guy who coordinated the amphibious landing was General Howley Mad Smith. And he pretty much said in his Coral and Brass book, it was like an autobiography or a biography on him, where he talked about that he wanted assurances that he would not be held responsible if the landing operation failed, because he disagreed with seizing that island, because it was heavily fortified and its strategic value to him was questionable. Some people say that it broke open the Japanese defense perimeter and then allowed naval and air and ground forces to kind of punch through the outer Japanese perimeter and start pushing into the Central Pacific. And then, of course, you talk about Anzio, which is a completely different scenario, because no amphibious landing is the same. So the purpose of Anzio was to outflank Field Marshal Kesselring's forces in Italy, outflank him, seize Rome, and cut off the German and Italian forces in the Italian peninsula. But instead, when the U.S. military forces landed, they kind of hesitated to build the Iron Mountain that we were talking about earlier. And then they moved too slow. And by then, Kesselring and the German Wehrmacht already pulled back to be able to fortify and contain the landing force there. So instead of, like I said before, instead of throwing a bobcat on a beach, they threw a beached whale. Because they were committed, the Americans pretty much had to slog their way out,
Right.
And as a result, learning from the lessons of Anzio and Tarawa, they realized that when they did the Normandy invasion in 1944, that they pretty much not only had to build the Iron Mountain quickly, but they also had to push out of the beachhead as quickly as possible in order to prevent the American and British and Canadian allied forces from being contained by the Germans on that narrow strip of beachhead.
So is it your turn, Rick, or mine?
It's your turn in my book, but I always have a question at the ready, Chris.
Well, why don't you go then, and then I'll.
Well, I'm gonna take us back in time. Can you handle some time jumping, David?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I love to bring in the audience questions and the things that they're interested in. And so Frank has a question. I'm gonna bring on Frank's question. He wants to know, what did the impact of the combined operations of the Union Navy and Army during the Civil War have on the initial development of the American amphibious warfare doctrine? So I can do my rewind imitation, and we can go back to the Civil War. And did any of that have an impact, or did it just sort of like happen and then kind of get forgotten about as soon as the war is over?
So there's a great book called The Roots of Amphibious Warfare that's made by a gentleman by the last name of Ohms, and he teaches at the Naval War College. And he talks exactly about this question. He answered the exact same question this gentleman here is asking. But the best thing about the Americans is also the worst thing, is that we don't learn our lessons sometimes, which means that in this case for the American Civil War, all the amphibious landings that were conducted, especially like seizing like Charleston and the various ports and all that stuff, and the whole famous damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. What the lessons that were learned at amphibious landings was completely forgotten, more or less, by the time the late 19th century rolls around, and it didn't do us any favors because of that. But there was one lesson some people argue about with the American Civil War, was having to do with the draft, and so when they were kind of doing the after action on the American Civil War, they said that pretty much whatever you do, if you're going to do the draft, you better do it right because of the draft rights during the American Civil War. That was one thing that I found in their little after action thing which set the stage for how they would mobilize the American people for the First World War. But for amphibious landings, Mr. Holmes would be the perfect gentleman to talk to for the roots of amphibious warfare, because the gentleman makes a great case. I've only read a little bit of his book, but I'm sure he makes that connection with today's modern amphibious capabilities.
Cool. My turn now, Rick?
Okay.
Okay. Way forward, machine.
All right.
So back in the day when we used to do this thing called travel, I would take groups to Omaha Beach all the time. And I would stand there at the Verville Draw and I would talk about what happened to Company A and how terrible it was. And every single tour I have done for 20 plus years, somebody always says, why weren't there any Marines here and why didn't they tell them what to do? So how do you answer that?
So that's like a based on opinion, right? So there's a lot of competition among the services even today, where it's about it's about resources and it's about like validity. Anytime a service can no longer show its validity or the importance it plays in national security or strategic planning, you get less resources. And it's just an opinion, right? So it's like if for the Army, having to have the Marines conduct amphibious landings and kind of break ashore in order to allow the Army to follow through wouldn't look necessarily good for the U.S. Army, so to speak.
Right, but I'm not even saying, not even on a large scale, but there doesn't seem to have been, like, even Marine officers on the SHAFE staff going, Ike, we've got a little experience getting our feet wet. Maybe you ought to try this.
Yeah.
But
I totally know what you're talking about. Like, especially when you look at when General Dwight Eisenhower was talking about the unification of the armed services,
right.
After the Second World War, you see that the Marine Corps is fighting once again for its existence until Congress passes a law, defining the Marine Corps' mission and saving it from being absorbed by the Army or any of the other services.
So, and the follow-on question from that is, in your research, did you come across anything in any of the Marine Corps archives saying their comments on the Normandy operation, like what they thought of how it went or what the...
Unfortunately, I didn't. I did see a lot of like the potential planning for Operation Downfall for the Japanese home islands, but for the Marine Corps' input on Normandy or any of the amphibious landings during that time in the European Africa theater, I haven't come across anything in the great research there. I can tell you that, gentlemen.
So they just didn't trust you. That's what you're saying.
They made a terrible mistake.
Oh, of course.
One more World War II question, and then we can kind of take a look at the present before we wrap up. But you made the argument in the book, which I thought was really interesting, that it wasn't just like submarines or bombers or infantry tactics that gave the Axis a strategic edge in World War II, that it was their amphibious warfare capability, Japan and Germany. And you suggest that they kind of threw away an opportunity they had to use their amphibious warfare capability to decisively change the outcome of the war. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like when we look at Nazi Germany and the fact they dominated Europe, we also forget that they also conducted amphibious operations themselves that had great strategic value. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is when the Germans land in Norway. They slip underneath the British radar. They secure Norway in order to secure critical iron ore deposits in Sweden to help fuel the industry. Then you also got the fact that by seizing Norway, they also extended the possibility of aviation and strategic bombing coverage against the United Kingdom. And then we also see like the Germans land in Crete by landing on the island of Crete, which is like the main southern island in Greece. They not only kicked the British out of the Eastern Mediterranean with the exception of Cyprus, but they now secured their line of supply that allows them to support the Italians in Libya, who are also going against the British in for dominance of North Africa. But then when you get to Operation Sea Lion, where the Germans win this extraordinary victory against the French, and the British the British are totally crushed. They do the Dunkirk invasion. Their forces are disorganized. They're using a civilian fleet to help the British Expeditionary Force arrive safely at home. The Germans have this golden opportunity to organize their amphibious capabilities and land on the shores of the southern part of the United Kingdom, and they don't. Instead, they use air power to try to seize control of the skies, which results in a blitz and completely fails. And then when you look at the Japanese, they use amphibious capabilities against the Russians, and they use it against the Chinese, and they seize critical ports and facilities and access to resources, and they even use it to great effect in taking control of the Dutch East Indies and knocking out the Americans from the Philippines. Now all they had to do was just continue their push out west toward Hawaii and the west coast of the United States, or even Alaska, where they seize the Aleutian Islands. So the fact is that even though like the Japanese amphibious landings in the Aleutian Islands and in the Central Pacific were more or less modest compared to the Allied forces, it struck undeniable fear in the Americans and the European powers, because now that you got the enemy at the gate, so to speak, and you have the entire west coast of the United States, which is unprepared for a global war they've just been thrusted into. And so they have these ideas of the Japanese landing on the beaches of California, seizing control of the cities there and whatnot. And then you see the blackouts, and then the civilian defense forces stepping up to help protect the cities. So even though the reality was that it probably would have took the Axis powers time to reach that far, the reality was that it struck a psychological fear into the heart of the United States and its allies. So it would have been interesting to see what would happen if the Japanese or the Germans were able to land on the mainland of the United States or on the shores of the United Kingdom. I mean, when we think about like 9/11, for example, the psychological fear and the emotional factor that it had of being struck in our own homeland was very powerful for our country. And the same could be said for the Second World War in that case, if the Axis powers did pursue that type of strategy.
Well,
no, go.
I think we have time for one more question, Chris.
Yes.
I think we probably would ask the same question at this point. Take us up to today. Is the amphibious warfare still relevant today? I mean, people still argue whether, please forgive me,
No, you're good.
whether the Marine Corps is relevant today.
Yeah.
I didn't say that, David. That one.
Okay, it's on.
Yeah,
Lock the doors.
I know. General Saint Mattis would have something to say about that. I can guarantee you that.
General Saint Mattis.
Yeah, he would have struck down thunder and lightning on us for being sacrilegious on that subject. But
You're up for Colonel, right?
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
If I get it right,
rescue yourself quickly.
If I get it right, the Marine Corps will be like, "Hey, Dave Nasca represented." If I get it wrong, then hey, Dave, we had a good run. It's time for you to move on, and then I'll be joining you at History Happy Hour.
Yeah, that's right. No pressure.
Fantastic.
Yeah, but again, it's just for me, it's an opinion. So, like what we talked about earlier was we're trying to predict how the next conflict or the next war is going to look like, right? And that's really the hardest part is determining what the future enemy is going to be, and what are the strategic and operational requirements of facing a potential threat against the United States. And so the military does what any good military does. They kind of put their finger in the pie in everything. So it's almost like they're putting a gamble, and they're spread loading the gamble across many. It's like playing Russian roulette or something. You're spreading it across many tables and stuff. So when you look at like cyber warfare, that's still a power projection capability that's still being developed and still being kind of tentatively tested. And we've seen it with the Russians being used against like the Baltic states or Georgia when they seize like a little sliver of territory from Georgia and stuff. We also see what the North Koreans use in cyber warfare, and the Chinese, of course, as well. We also seen the Americans use special operators. And when we think about special operators, we think about Afghanistan in 2001, special operators riding in horseback, rallying the Northern Alliance and seizing Kabul. And then, of course, we think about like space warfare, and then the new Space Force that's being established. And the fact that now space is now the new global common, so to speak, where it's open to the entire international community, and the person that's able to access space and those moon, access to the moon and resources. And that sounds bizarre in science fiction, but it's the new reality. It's about being able to influence not only our region, but a global common here. So when you look at amphibious warfare is still relevant, but again, it just depends on what are the strategic and operational requirements. So for amphibious warfare, there's something that's very powerful about the fact that you have a foreign military power sitting off the shore, ready to land in your own country, kick down the door, and put their boot on your neck when they want you to do something that you don't want to do. Because going back to Clausewitz, what is it? It's war is politics through other means, right? So how do I compel a state actor to do what I wanted to do? And what is the cost I'm going to impose on that state actor when they don't do what I want them to do? So by using amphibious capabilities, it makes a hostile state actor or even a non-state actor question, what would I do if I attacked the United States 9/11 style in Afghanistan? Well, when you look at 2001, you see the fact that the Marines conducted the longest amphibious landing in history, where they're able to fly from ships aboard or on the Arabian Sea right into the heart of Afghanistan, with refueling points in Pakistan and whatnot. And the fact that they were able to put a MU-size element, which is a Marine Expeditionary Unit for a battalion landing team, a BLT, landing it over in Afghanistan, able to establish control of an airfield and allow follow-on forces to build up in that area, speaks volumes in itself. That shows the power and the relevancy of amphibious warfare, just like today.
So they might keep you then, David. That sounds
I
like
think that's good.
Probably not. They'll keep you around for comic relief. That's about it.
I give you a 10 out of 10 for that. That's awesome.
And then when you look at the Chinese and the Russians, they're also developing their amphibious capabilities as well. I mean, look at the South China Sea. Look at the Arctic Circle. These are global commons that they decided to make territorial waters. Why? Because they have access to not just energy resources, oil, coal, whatnot, but also access to food supplies as well, and access to international trading lanes. So whoever can control the Arctic Circle and the South China Sea could be able to have a significant influence on the international system, And that's like a whole separate issue. It's very fascinating, I can tell you
Next
that much.
Next book.
tentatively titled.
Tentatively titled.
Yeah. David Nasca, thank you so much. Your book
David.
is The Emergence of American Amphibious Warfare, 1898 to 1945. And we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Rick, Chris, thank you so much. I had a great time, and I enjoyed having a couple of drinks with you.
Excellent. Cheers.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Whoop. Oh, I cut him off. Didn't mean to do that. Woo. Okay. So, Semper Fi, etc.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Et cetera. So next week, Chris, we're dealing with a different perspective on World War II, and author Sean McKeegan says that the key figure of World War II is not Churchill, it's not Hitler, it's not Roosevelt, it is Stalin, and he's written a new history of World War II called Stalin's War, which is a reassessment of the war, putting Stalin at the center of it. And this book is so new, Chris, it does not even come out until 2 days after our interview with him. So
we were cool before.
This is going to be hot stuff. So we hope everybody tunes in to us and
we've got a scoop.
And checks that out. Right. We've got a scoop. You're going to find out about it first. So unfortunately, the people who want to read the book in advance are going to have a little bit of difficulty. I may have a little bit of difficulty because it's a very thick book.
I'm just about done with it. It's very, very good, and there's lots in there.
You are bragging. You are. Oh, I am just about done with it. Oh,
of course
nice.
Well,
Well, of course, you're going to then disappear into the pub system in London.
That's right. So
tomorrow,
I knew I had to finish before tomorrow.
Emerge in a cold sweat on Fridays. So it's a good thing that you got that done in advance. But thank you everybody for joining us, and we really appreciate your being here, whether you're watching the show live or on tape. Thanks for coming, and please come again next week.
Be safe, everybody.